Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. As you can see, I'm joined by Scott Ritter. Scott, thanks so much for joining me this evening. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Yourself?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. Well, we have a lot to get to, everybody. So let us begin. Hit the like button as you come on the stream. That helps boost us in the algorithm. I want to welcome everyone. We have a huge show today. I want to begin, actually, Scott, with Vladimir Putin visiting Kursk. Following a blitz by the Russian army, taking over 12 villages, closing in on the Sudza pocket, occupied by Ukraine dramatically. And I want to ask about, Vladimir Putin showed up in military uniform just following Rubio and Trump's team announcing that Ukraine had agreed to a 30-day ceasefire that Trump's team is now going to bring to Russia. But here, Scott, is what Vladimir Putin had to say during his meeting with military forces in Kursk.
Our goal is to have the ultimate defeat of the enemy who's entrenched in our territory in the Kursk region as soon as possible. That continues to fight here and to fully liberate the territory of the Kursk region.
So I wanted to ask you, Scott, talk about what has been going on here, because we had this 30-day ceasefire announced that the ball is in Russia's court, as Trump and Rubio have been saying, and essentially the entire collective West at this point. And then Vladimir Putin goes to Kursk following these major successful operations there that are driving the Ukrainians out. What's your reaction to all of this?
First of all, we need to point out that the Russians have never allowed the political calendar to get in the way of military operations. Never once has Russia set an artificial date. We need to do X by this date. We need to do Y by this date. We need to do X to achieve political impact by this date. The Russians have been consistent from the very beginning of the special military operation that, what happens on the ground militarily is driven by military objectives. And those objectives are accomplished as it happens. So I don't think there's any connection between Vladimir. If Rubio and Waltz hadn't met in Saudi Arabia, Vladimir Putin would still be showing up in Kursk in a military uniform. This is about the liberation of Russian territory, sacred Russian territory. And, this is about sending a signal to Ukraine and the world, independent of whatever negotiations are taking place, that Russia is serious about this. There will be consequences for Ukraine. Putin ordered Gerasimov to continue operations following the liberation of Kursk to build a buffer zone, a security buffer zone in Ukraine, separating Ukraine from Russia. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing as this conflict continues, as Russia continues to defeat the Ukrainian military, drive them back, as Russia achieves its borders. Russia will continue the assault into what Russia acknowledges to be Ukrainian territory to establish buffer zones. Russia will never again allow Ukraine the opportunity to fire shells from Ukrainian soil that impact Russia. Putin's warned about this from the very beginning, and this is the reality. Welcome to Russian negotiations 101. The Russians have said that whatever happens on the negotiating table, it has to be related to the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that the Russian terms are quite specific. The totality of constitutional Russia will be Russian. There's no negotiation. There's no, territorial swap. There's no holding on to a piece of Russia to get this. All of Russia is Russia, and all of Russia includes Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, and Kursk, by the way. And at the end of the day, once this territory there will be a demilitarized zone in Ukraine, and only Ukraine. Russia will not demilitarize. I don't know what anybody else thinks is going to happen, but Russian troops will be on Russian soil. There will be no pulling back. There will be Russia will protect Russia. Ukraine, the defeated nation, will have to make these concessions. It's just the reality of it. And the longer Ukraine holds out, the more stark the reality will become. But Russia's not doing this to get the upper hand at the negotiating table. These military operations were defined by military objectives that were established by Russia well before the current round of negotiations began. And Russia's been consistent from day one as to what these objectives are. Neutrality for Ukraine, demilitarization, denazification. End of story.
And that's a message in and of itself, though, isn't it, Scott? Because some have noted that Vladimir Putin just showing up in a military uniform, it might be coincidental. It might have nothing to do with this announcement of the third-day ceasefire, but it's significant because throughout this whole duration of the conflict, Putin has not been donning military gear. He has not been using ploys like the sweaty sweatshirt, as Pepe Escobar calls Zelensky, always wearing that sweatshirt, never wearing any attire worth the professionalism of a politician. What do you make of this? Do you find that there is any message sent here, even if it isn't about the negotiations, though, you said to the entire world, but do you find that this might be a message to the United States, the collective West, those who are at the root cause of this conflict?
I don't think Russia's in the business of sending messages to the United States or Europe. Vladimir Putin is the leader of the Russian nation, and Vladimir Putin sends messages to the Russian people. And the point he's trying to make to the Russian people is that we are at war. We don't call it a war, but it's a warlike situation. Mother Russia was invaded and occupied by terrorists. And that's the one thing that he pointed out today, is that every Ukrainian soldier captured in Kursk will be treated as a terrorist because there isn't a state of war. This is a special military operation. I always get a kick out of watching people react to that. It's not, that's just a made up Russian term. No, it's a real Russian term, and it has real legal consequences. If I just ask people to remember, if you think Russia's at war with Ukraine, go visit Kiev and walk around. And take a look and say, wait a minute, it's an intact city. There's parties taking place. Russia's not at war with Kiev, because if Russia was at war with Kiev, Kiev wouldn't exist. Neither would any other major Ukrainian urban area. Russia's not at war. It's a special military operation, which is designed to protect the Russian people of the Donbass and of Novorossiya from the predations of the Banderists, the right sector, the ultranationalists, these murderous thugs, rapists who came in and sought to ethnically cleanse and culturally commit cultural genocide against the Russian people. And Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he is the president of the Russian nation, not the federation, the Russian nation. The Russian nation is the Russian people. The Russian people are defined not by geographic borders, but by shared heritage, culture, religion, etc. And the Russians of the Ukraine are protected by Donald Trump, by Vladimir Putin. This is what's happening right now. And he is the president of the Russian people, the Russian nation, and he's sending a signal that you violate Russia, you pay a price. Oh, by the way, he made it clear that mercenaries aren't protected by the Geneva Convention. Neither apparently are UAV operators. Those Ukrainians that run around, hunt down wounded Russians and murder them live on TV, then put them on the Telegram channel. Apparently in Kursk right now, when the Russians capture a UAV unit, they're executed on the site. I'm not condemning this. I'm not condoning this. Can't really condemn it either. These are murderers. When you come on Russian soil, you're not a soldier. You're a terrorist. And when you're a terrorist using, suicide drones to hunt down wounded people and assassinate them, to murder people, to murder civilians, you aren't protected by the Geneva Convention. And this is the reality that we're dealing with here. This isn't some people think this is a game. Some people think this is a ploy. Some people think this is life and death. And Russia's making it clear that it is a life and death situation. And Vladimir Putin's showing the Russian people just how serious he takes this situation. They're in the end game of this conflict. It's not a time to get soft. It's not a time to let up. Just because people are talking about the potential of peace doesn't mean that you quit. And I think putting that uniform on is a signal to the Russian people. I am the leader of Russia. I am the wartime leader. I am the commander in chief. Therefore, I will dress like the commander in chief on this occasion, making military decisions and giving orders to the troops that I command.
Yeah, good points. I wanted to now, while Russia is focusing on Russia, as you said, you have a prominent Australian media outlet, The Conversation, talking about why Russia's armed forces have proven resilient in the war in Ukraine. And the first thing they bring up, they're reacting to this so-called ceasefire that Ukraine supposedly agreed to during these negotiations with Saudi Arabia. Now, they say few analysts would argue today Ukraine is winning the war. Russia has the upper hand militarily, even if it's not translating to dramatic battlefield successes. Scott, talk about what's been going on then on the battlefield. And, I feel like you have written this article and probably wrote it much better on this program. Talk about what actually is happening right now on the battlefield that is shaping the reality of negotiations right now.
Well, we're looking at the culmination of years of effort. I mean, this war has been a conflict in transition. It started out, phase one was I guess we can call it the shock and awe phase of the conflict, which was designed to put significant pressure on Ukraine to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table. That was the purpose. It wasn't a 3-day blitz to take Kiev. The only people that talked about Kiev following that time period were the director of the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Scott Ritter. Because I think we all believed that Russia was going to war against Ukraine, an honest to God war, the kind of war where you kill everything in front of you, destroy everything. That's not what Russia was doing. Russia was seeking to put pressure on Ukraine. They weren't there to destroy the Ukrainian military. They were there to, put pressure on the Ukrainian government, and it succeeded. Within 6 days of the initiation of this special military operation, Ukraine sent a delegation to Gomel. They had 3 successive meetings in Gomel. Then they moved on to Turkey. And by the end of March, we're talking literally, a little bit more than a month into this conflict, they had come, the agreement, the peace agreement, the Istanbul communique was ready to be signed. Success. The Russian operation was a success, except that the Ukrainians didn't follow through. Zelensky fell victim to pressure from NATO, from Boris Johnson, from the United States, and they continued the conflict. We then moved into phase 2 of this conflict, where Russia followed through with its good faith gesture, withdrew from around Kiev, withdrew from Sumy, and then began to continue its offensive operation, the goal of liberating the totality of Lugansk and Donetsk, to consolidate the land bridge that they had between Kherson and through Zaporizhia to Donetsk. And they were very successful. A lot of people don't remember that from, April, May of 2022 up until August, the Russians were slaughtering the Ukrainian. The Ukrainian army was being destroyed piecemeal. But then they got a $48 billion injection in the arm, money, equipment, training. The Ukrainians were able to rebuild a military with significant Western assistance. They moved to phase 3, which is the initial Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kharkov region, then later on in Kherson. Very successful offensive because the Russians weren't postured to receive it. I don't know why the Russians weren't ready for it. Everybody who was watching what was going on Telegram and Twitter knew damn well the Ukrainians were getting ready to launch a counterattack. They were bragging about it, but the Russians apparently were ill prepared and they got pushed back. And then we get to phase 4, Russian mobilization, partial mobilization, 300,000 men, the entrenchment, digging in, training their military. This is where Surovikin came in, General Armageddon, and he began an air campaign to destroy Ukrainian air defense so that the Russians could begin putting pressure on Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, et cetera, another phase of the operation. And they ground the Ukrainian army down again. And now the Ukrainians, we moved to phase 5, the summer counteroffensive of 2023, where the Ukrainians built up, 12 brigades, and they were going to punch through Robotyno onto, to Melitopol, split the land bridge. The Russians dug in, defended, and they destroyed this Ukrainian army. The Bakhmut counteroffensive. And then we moved on to the next phase, which is sort of the phase that we're in right now, which is the Russians having taken the initiative, now just transition into the grind. And, the Russians had a machine now. They have a defense industry that's been fully mobilized. producing equipment like you've never seen before. They outproduce the entire collective West together. They have volunteers. This war has become patriotic for the Russians. They are fighting for a cause that the majority of Russians believe in, and therefore the Russians are able to recruit numbers that not only replace casualties on the battlefield, but allow significant reserves to be established. And they get into this grinding. Now, people are looking at the map and they're expecting, these big arrows back and forth. It's not the game the Russians are playing. The Russians right now are in the game of, we are going to wear down the Ukrainians along the totality of the line of contact, put pressure on them until at some point in time we reach the culminating point, the tipping point, and then the Ukrainians will collapse and the Russians will make movement. Now, people will wonder, what would that look like? Kursk, because Kursk is the same thing. The Ukrainians pumped in 100,000 troops. The Russians came in initially, contained it, and then they just gradually built up their forces. These aren't dramatic. I mean, they had, besides the pipeline operation, which was pretty damn dramatic. But even prior to that, the Russians had reached the point where the Ukrainians had nobody left to commit to the battle. And as a result, as the Russians grind down, the Ukrainians have to make adjustments or else they'll find themselves surrounded. They begin to withdraw. As they withdraw, the bridges get cut. They can't move. They get bombed. They have to abandon their equipment, run for their lives. They get ambushed, surrounded, surrendered. That's what collapse looks like. And you're going to see the Russians rapidly clear out Kursk and push on into Sumy. And I think we're going to start seeing this more and more along the Eastern Front, depending on whose geography you're using from a Ukrainian perspective, the Eastern Front, with the Russians again pushing aggressively. The Ukrainians are they're running out of everything: manpower, equipment, ammunition. About the only thing they have left are drones. But it looks like, as shown in Kursk, the Russians have figured out Ukrainian drone warfare, and right now they have hunting units to go out there and hunt down Ukrainian drone operators. So the second that a Ukrainian drone goes in the air, the Russians not only try to neutralize that, but then they've been an aggressive hunt to find the people operating those drones. And, just using simple intelligence preparation of the battlefield, you capture a couple of these drones, you understand the ranges that we're operating. So when you see a drone, you can draw a range arc. Then you basically look for roads, you look for buildings, and you put your reconnaissance on there. You see where drones are recovered, and then you come in and you kill them. And right now the Ukrainians are running out of drone operators. They have drones. They're producing them right there on the spot, but they're running out of drone operators because the Russians are just hunting them down and killing them. And then when you don't have a drone operator, you can't operate the drones. You lose your advantage, and the Russians push forward even more aggressively. And that's what we're seeing on the entire front.
And where does the right as Zelensky wasn't actually in the room, right as Ukraine was negotiating with the Trump team, Kiev actually conducted a drone attack, hundreds of drones in the Moscow region. Where do these kind of attacks factor in? It seems that every time that Ukraine is on the ropes on the battlefield, something like this happens. Where do they factor in? How does Russia take care of them? And what's their response from here, given that we just had a negotiation that was going on, and yet Ukraine was also at the same time attacking Russia?
Look, there's a psychological aspect of this attack. There's a political aspect. There's a military aspect. It's an act of terrorism. The Ukrainians are trying to get the Russians to overreact. It's a deliberate provocation on the part of Ukraine. And there are many people out there who are like, oh, Russia now needs to deploy the Oreshnik, and they need to do this, they need to do that. But when you think about it, I mean, I don't mean to be too crass here, because any civilian death is one too many. 3 civilians were killed, a number were wounded. I mean, that many die in an attack on Donetsk, that many die. I mean, the Ukrainians are slaughtering Russian civilians in occupied Kursk by the dozens, by the hundreds. I just think Russia rides this out. It's a non-entity. This isn't the first drone attack on Moscow, and it won't be the last drone attack. The Ukrainians sent multiple waves totaling more than 330 drones. The vast majority of them were shot down by Russian air defense. The handful that got through, a couple hit their targets. The rest, I think, were shot down, and then debris rained down and caused some damage. But from a strategic standpoint, this was a non-event, a blip. It becomes a strategic, it develops strategic impact if the Russians overreact and do something in response that has a significant impact on international opinion. Yeah, I think the Ukrainians made a huge mistake because it wasn't a successful attack. It didn't accomplish anything meaningful, and all it did is expose the Ukrainians as the duplicitous, disgusting excuse of a nation that they are. I mean, I'm sorry for all the pro-Ukrainian people out there, but hey, Ukraine supports Stepan Bandera, strike 1, 2, and 3 all at once. We don't go anywhere else besides that. But they launched this attack. There was no military purpose behind this. It was done to be deliberately provocative, which means targeting civilians, to kill civilians, to get Russia to overreact. Ukraine can't be trusted. And that's the other signal that's being sent out there, is that Ukraine's not an honest broker here, not an honest player, not an honest negotiator. They're as dishonest and disingenuous as the day is long. And I think Russia is going to use that to their advantage. This is not going to turn out to be a positive for Ukraine. In fact, this attack on Moscow using these drones is going to turn out to be one of the bigger negatives for Ukraine. It's going to come back and haunt them in spades as this negotiation goes on, because everybody now has seen the truth about Ukraine. And I mean, we see it over and over again. Zelensky coming out after the negotiators agreed to the ceasefire, knowing full well that the United States made it clear to Ukraine that there will be territorial concessions that have to be made. And Zelensky coming out immediately saying there will be no terror. He just basically made null and void whatever commitments were made in Riyadh, which is, again, why the Russians haven't said anything. They're like, we're going to wait for the Americans to come and tell us what's going on before we react to anything. And meanwhile, Zelensky's opened his mouth and he's just destroyed, the very essence of Ukraine's negotiating position by telling the United States that it doesn't matter what Yermak and the others said around the table. We're not ever going to give up any territory. Well, that means you didn't negotiate in good faith.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into the nuts and bolts of this Kursk operation you referenced. But before we do, I think it's a good segue into exactly what you were just referencing, the negotiations. And I wanted to first talk to you about, here is what Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz said after the meeting in Riyadh that led to a 30-day ceasefire agreement that the United States brokered with Ukraine first, which I think is key here. Here's what they said.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. I want to personally we both want to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, His Majesty, for hosting us, for making this possible. They've been instrumental in this process, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us here today. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball is now in their court. And again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
So the ball is in Russia's court. And we heard that a lot, Scott, after this. The ball is in Russia's court. Everyone was saying this. Politico, Kalis, the EU, I don't know if I'm saying her name right, but the EU so-called diplomat, the entirety of the collective West was saying the ball is in Russia's court. Well, here's what Donald Trump had to say in a press conference at the White House during a meeting with the Irish Prime Minister.
With Biden, they wanted to take the whole country, but I think I've stopped that, but we'll see. But yeah, there are things you could do that wouldn't be pleasant in a financial sense. I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. I want to see peace, and we'll see. But in a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia.
That was his reaction to if Russia were to decline this agreement. Scott, talk about your reaction to this. There's a lot of bringing it to the Russians, saying, Russia, now the ball's in your court. You need to be the ones to reciprocate now that Ukraine has shown a gesture toward peace. What do you make of all this?
theater, in some cases, theater of the absurd. Let's not forget that how did we get to this spot? We got to this spot because Donald Trump was being advised by Keith Kellogg. Oh, by the way, Keith Kellogg was fired today as the envoy to Ukraine. He's no longer going to be involved in any aspect of this because Keith Kellogg is dumber than dirt. Keith Kellogg is not informed about the realities of Russia or Ukraine. Keith Kellogg is a propagandist. And Keith Kellogg was being harmful to this process. Now, what do I mean by that? You see, because of Keith Kellogg's failures, Trump had to send a real negotiator to Moscow, and that was Stephen Witkoff, who he sent back in February 11th, I believe, to bring back Mark. I can't remember his name. The American school teacher got caught up in the drugs, and Fogel, and bring him back. But while he was there, he met with Vladimir Putin. I just want to emphasize this again. Vladimir Putin doesn't meet with anybody. Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia. And he takes being president very, very seriously. So when you get an audience for Vladimir Putin, it's not a photo op. It's not meant to, work public opinion. It's because something of substance is being discussed, and not just being discussed, but the Russians expect something of substance to come from the meeting. That this isn't an experiment. This isn't dipping your toes in the water. This is, we've already agreed that we're going to be serious here. We agree on what outcomes we want. Let's get it done, nail it down, and go forward. And Witkoff came to talk reality. And he had a very real discussion with Vladimir Putin. And, Vladimir Putin isn't the kind of guy to say one thing in public, say another thing in private. We know what Vladimir Putin's position is on a ceasefire, and we know what the terms and conditions are. And he reiterated those to Witkoff. He also spoke about other things. He brought in Kirill Dmitriev to talk about the economy and to talk about the potential for bettering relations. Nobody knows the Russian economic reality better than Vladimir Putin and Kirill Dmitriev. Donald Trump doesn't know anything about the Russian economy. Nothing. Straight up. Nothing. Why? Because the CIA doesn't know anything about the Russian economy. Why? The CIA is not plugged in. We have distanced ourselves from Russia. We aren't engaged in Russia. We don't have businessmen traveling. I mean, I don't want to get into the CIA's, collection, how they do things. But one of the things, CIA has a domestic station, and here in the United States. And one thing the CIA does is when businessmen go abroad, the CIA brings them back and talks to them, debriefs them. Sometimes even gives them follow-on tasking so that when they go overseas, they'll ask certain questions and do this. Not covertly, they're not spying, just serendipitously gathering information and bringing it back. And from that, the CIA builds dossiers on, economic health, who the players are, et cetera. Well, ain't nobody going to Russia right now, so there ain't nobody to debrief. The CIA knows zero. I know more about Russia's economy than the CIA because I've spent more time in Russia during this current period talking to Russians than any CIA operative has because they just aren't operating. Even the guys in the station, they're shut down. They can't lift their heads without the KGB or the FSB coming down on them. So, Trump isn't informed at all. He has outsiders like the Secretary of Commerce, like Kellogg and others, who are talking, nonsense about Russian energy security, about Russian financial system, et cetera. They just don't know how it works. The only people that truly know how Russia works are the Russians, and they're not afraid. They're not nervous. They're not anything. Donald Trump thinks he has something on them. He has nothing on them, but he lives in his own little fantasy world. Putin doesn't care. Putin and Dmitriev put Witkoff straight on what the reality is and why Russia would like to get this thing over with, and what benefits could be accrued by both parties if they did this. Witkoff brought that back to Trump, who disregarded Kellogg, called Putin directly. 90-minute conversation. Again, I just want to emphasize a 90-minute conversation between Trump and Putin. Why is this important? Because what they talked about was from president to president, and that doesn't change. The conditions that Putin set forth that iterated to Trump on that phone call are set in concrete. And Trump knows that. He knows this. He knows what Putin told him. And then they followed up with a meeting with Rubio and Lavrov and Witkoff and Dmitriev and Waltz and Ushakov in Riyadh, where, once again, the Russians educated the Americans about the reality of the Russian position. So, knowing this, then Rubio and Waltz sit down with the Ukrainians in Riyadh and act in a way that is literally 180 degrees out. Why would they do that? I mean, this makes no sense from a logic standpoint, because they know darn well that everything they're agreeing to with the Ukrainians will be unacceptable to Russia. And yet they want to say the ball's in Russia's court. Danny, you hit on something, and this is the key. When I first heard Rubio and I mean, I'm sure you read my X, or maybe you read my X. You know, I sent out 2 tweets. I just have lost all faith in Trump and his team. That was my gut feeling. I read it and I'm like, come on, man, this is amateur hour. What are you doing? Well, my wife always tells me that maybe I should take a deep breath and not tweet one of the first thing in my mind, because, you know, reflect on it like I used to do before the age of social media. But I slept on it. I woke up in the morning, and you know what I saw? Tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet, or post, whatever the hell we'll call them, Zeets or whatever these things are, from everybody saying the same thing. Do you remember after the State of the Union address, or what we call the State of the Union, the president's address to the joint session of Congress, all the Democrats came out to speak it, and they all said the same thing. They were all reading from the same script, saying the same thing, which means that none of what they're saying is spontaneous. None of it's genuine. It's all coming from a script written before the fact, that this was a play, this was theater. So now when you see all of Europe responding with the exact same phrases, yeah, this wasn't a negotiation. This was theater. Now, what was the purpose of the theater then? What's taking place here? So we back up even further. All of those Europeans that now said, you know, we support peace, we support a ceasefire, the ball is in Putin's court. We support peace, we support ceasefire, this is a wonderful thing, ball is in Putin's court. We support that, ball is in Putin's court. Just days before that, they were having emergency meetings in London and Paris where they're talking about nuclear war, where the French are talking about bringing their nuclear deterrence forward. The French and the British are talking about boots on the ground, airplanes in the air, the whole thing. War. 800 billion euros coming up. Ursula, van der Leyen is just, wow. And all of a sudden, that's all gone. And they're all saying the ceasefire is a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. The ball's in Putin's court. I don't think what happened in Riyadh was about convincing the Russians about anything, Danny. I think what happened in Riyadh was setting a trap for the Europeans, and they fell for it because they have all said that a ceasefire is a good thing. If you go back in time, many of them were saying there can be no ceasefire, not until Putin withdraws, no ceasefire. They've all, across the board, without exception, said a ceasefire is a good thing. The ball's in Putin's court. Now, let's think about that. That's a game, right? That's tennis. I just bang the ball back in. You got to now play it back. So what's Russia going to do? Well, we don't know. The Russians, of course, are very savvy. And they said, we'll wait for the American team to come in and tell us what exactly is going on before we respond. But they've hinted at it. The senior Russian officials who matter have said, we definitely like a ceasefire. We want a ceasefire. Ooh, you see what just happened there? The ceasefire is a good thing. In Russia, they want a ceasefire. We want a ceasefire. Yep. Count us in. They just volleyed it back. But there are conditions. And America knows damn well what these conditions are. And it's interesting because this negotiating team is showing up in Moscow. Marco Rubio is not going to be there. He's going to be at the G7 because he's the weakest link in the negotiating team. You know who's going to be the big dog? Steve Witkoff, the guy who started it all. Donald Trump's right-hand man, the man that Donald Trump trusts more than anybody else out there. He's taking the lead. Michael Waltz will be there to talk to Ushakov, but Witkov's going to be the guy. He's the guy who already met with Putin. He has a relationship with Putin. They've already talked. And there's going to be another phone call. Think about it. There's going to be another phone call between Trump and Putin, the principals. Why would they talk? If Trump's, oh, I'm going to threaten you, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. That's all theater. Trump and Putin are going to talk brass tacks. And basically, Russia's going to volley it back. And when they leave, Russia's going to go, we accept the ceasefire. But there are conditions, preconditions that have to be met. The ball's in Ukraine's court. Oh, you see what just happened there? And now Europe can't say, well, no, because Europe already agreed to the game. The ball's in Putin's court. Putin went, okay, we want a ceasefire. Ball's in your court. If you're not serious, we're going to find out how serious you are about a ceasefire. We've set our conditions. They're reality-based. America has said these are realistic conditions. These, Russia has every right to ask this. Ball's in Europe's court. I think that's what's happening here, because Trump was in a situation where he was receiving huge fallout in Europe. We're talking about the end of the NATO. Now, I mean, some people like me were like, yay, NATO's gone. But from an American standpoint, from, institutional standpoint, it's not that easy to unplug. It's very precipitous action. And I don't think Trump's there yet. And so if you're not going to unplug from NATO, if you're not going to totally divorce yourself from Europe, you have to get Europe to come on board. And I think Trump just did that. And this is my guess. Now we'll find out on Friday. What happens. I could be I could be wrong. We'll find out on Friday. But this is my take, because logic dictates that Donald Trump and the U.S. negotiating team, Steve Witkoff, who's a serious man, when they have been told what Russia's red lines are in no uncertain terms, and they've acknowledged it. You've seen the statements come out of the White House. Russia has every right to do this. Russia did not start this war. If I were in Russia's shoes, I would have done the same thing. This is Russian territory. We can't expect Russia to give everything back. No NATO membership, no this, that, and the other thing. You can't say all that and then turn around and go, yeah, but we're only going to do what the Ukrainians tell us to do. There's no logic to that, no common sense. There's no reason except to suck Europe in, to get them to buy into the ceasefire being the desired path, as opposed to all this nonsense about rearmament and war. The ball's in Putin's court. That, again, that phrase implies a volley. You're volleying back and forth. They didn't say Putin must adhere to this or die. We support a ceasefire. The ball's in Putin's court. Putin went, okay. We don't know, but my guess is he's going to say, yeah, we're playing the game. We want a ceasefire. We're ready. We do it 30 days. Let's go. But there are conditions. Volley back. Ball's in Europe's court. And then we'll find out how serious Europe is. Because at the end of the day, the Ukrainians aren't going to get what they want. At the end of the day, the longer this game, volleying, goes back and forth, the more likelihood is we're going to see collapses on the Eastern Front that we saw in Kursk. We're going to see the Russians pushing out of Kursk into Sumy, building a buffer zone. Vladimir Putin directed Gerasimov to begin capturing a buffer zone in Sumy. And the longer this goes, the worse it gets for Ukraine. And Donald Trump threatening sanctions and all that would be the end of the peace. And again, I would hope that people like Tulsi Gabbard would tell him, Mr. President, it's not going to work. You're not going to collapse the Russian economy. The Russians will outlast us. They will destroy Ukraine. And then we'll have a very difficult situation in Europe that we can never unplug. Remember, Mr. President, our strategic objective is to unplug from Europe and reallocate resources to the Pacific. If you go down this path, we're going to be trapped in Europe forever. So I just think there's a lot of theater going on.
A lot of people have been asking me about, you mentioned this theater. And one of the things about this theater that has been striking is that it does kind of prolong this process. You just mentioned the longer that this goes, actually the worse it's going to get for the United States and the Trump administration, because there will be outcomes on the battlefield that will be very detrimental to especially the US's image, as if it needs to get lower on the world stage. But the military aid and the intel piece I want you to address, because a lot of people have been asking, Danny, doesn't this just prolong the conflict? Doesn't this just, like, what if there's a push toward peace? How does this factor in? I mean, does it factor into the analysis that you had about the trap for Europe, or is there something else going on here? Because it was a very quick about turn. It was take it away from Zelensky. It seemed like Zelensky was on the ropes to, oh, well, you know, Ukraine gets its aid back. It gets its intel back. I don't know if that was actually shut off, but it gets everything it had before back. And now Ukraine is back in the good graces now to Russia. So how does this factor in? Because it does seem to prolong things. What's your thoughts?
Well, first of all, let's make sure everything's in the proper perspective. The American decision to halt aid and halt intelligence sharing was not done in concert with Russians. There are no guarantees to the Russians that we were going to do this. There was no precondition. It was an American initiative to punish Zelensky. That's it. Zelensky came to the White House and misbehaved. And this was a punishment to put Zelensky in his place. As far as the Russians are concerned, it was like, well, okay, you want to do that? We're not going to argue. But the Russians don't have a vote. This isn't a precondition. The Russians didn't say, you know, in order for us to move forward, you have to halt military aid. We have to do that's part of, I think, halting military aid's part of their precondition for a ceasefire. But in all this workup, never once did the Russians say, you have to do this, you have to do that. So let's keep Russia out of this. This has nothing to do with Russia. It has to do with America putting pressure on Zelensky, America putting pressure on Ukraine. And you put the pressure on Ukraine, you got the outcome that you wanted, and now you bring things back to where they were. I mean, does it add to lethality for the Russians? Yeah, sure. It's war. Is it going to stop the Russians from moving forward? No, it didn't stop them before when we were providing aid, et cetera. And again, when we say aid, what's going in right now, to my understanding, is the last remnants of the Biden funding. Now, there's a continuing resolution in place. I don't know how much money, if any, is allocated for Ukraine in this resolution and what it's attached to. But the bottom line is the resolution hasn't been passed yet. That money hasn't been allocated. It takes months for funding to turn into aid. So what aid are we talking about? This isn't like the emergency lend-lease where things were flowing in rapid. This is just a political decision to hit the on switch and the conveyor belt's moving, but there's not any material on the conveyor belt, not American material. There's some European stuff coming in, but there's just not much there. Intelligence, you know, that's a different thing. This enables Ukraine to, you know, use the ATACMS, use the Scalp, use the Storm Shadow. But again, the United States already had restrictions on that intelligence in terms of deep strike, et cetera. So this gives the Ukrainians the ability to apply these weapons, you know, in a shallower front on the battlefield. But Russia had already adapted to that. They shoot down the vast majority of these weapons when they're fired, and the ones that hit the ground, you know, they do inflict casualties, but not game-changing casualties. So it doesn't change anything. Nothing. It's pure politics. It was pressure put on Ukraine by the United States in a vacuum, meaning there was no connectivity to Russia. From a Russian perspective, it just doesn't matter because it was never part of the negotiation. That wasn't on the table. The United States didn't give Russia something and then take it away from Russia. Russia was never a factor. Russia was never consulted. This was pressure the United States put on Ukraine unilaterally. And now that Ukraine has behaved in a way that we found to be acceptable, we have rewarded them by hitting the on switch. But in the big picture, doesn't change anything.
Yeah, well, another question that I've received that maybe you've seen also is wondering about the order of things coming out with this. You mentioned the trap earlier for Europe, but at the same time, the narrative to the overall public, which I think has significance, is now, you know, as you said, the ball is in Russia's court, but we're going to bring this to the Russians. A lot of people have been asking, well, hey, is this another way of trying to pressure Russia, trying to bully Russia. Now, I agree with you. I don't think that's going to work at all. But that seems to be at least what is apparent here. What is your take on this? It's like the order of things. Well, you talk to the Ukrainians, you put them in line, but at the same time, what comes out of it is this kind of first step from what many people are telling me is, and what I agree with, is that the United States is the root cause of this conflict, the perpetrator in many ways of why this is happening, and they're the ones kind of dictating terms. What do you make of all this?
Well, first of all, let's understand there's the Biden United States and then there's the Trump United States. The two are not the same. So we can't speak of the United States as a singularity when it comes to this conflict. The Biden administration started this war, funded this war, furthered this war. The Trump administration seeking to end this war. They inherited policies and trajectories from the Biden administration, but the Trump administration is not here to rubber stamp the Biden administration's policies. They're here to stop the war, to end the war. It's tough to stop a war in midstream. As we have discussed, there's political complexities, both in the United States, because the war had bipartisan support in Congress, and Trump has to run interference against Congress. It definitely had the support of the military-industrial commission complex. It had the support of the State Department, a regime change complex. It had the support of our allies in Europe, and Trump has to detangle these various webs. It's not an easy process to do. Plus, he has to reestablish a basis upon which we can talk to the Russians. Biden had cut it all off totally. There was no communications connectivity. Trump has to rebuild that. So if you're going to sit here and go, well, America started this, so screw Trump. I would say, screw you. Yeah, America started this. We got that. This guy's trying to finish it. And I wish people would focus on that, because that's the most important thing here. Donald Trump, if we're going to take him at face value, is trying to stop this war, trying to bring it to an end. Maybe imperfectly, we don't know, because it's confusing to try and read the tea leaves coming out of the White House today. They send a lot of contradictory signals, but we know what his stated objectives are. And it's not the strategic defeat of Russia. And we know this because we have stopped the offensive cyber operations against Russia as a good faith gesture. And we are trying to negotiate an end to this conflict. It's difficult. And the other thing I would say is we have to stop treating the American negotiation with the Ukrainians in Riyadh as the first step. No, it's not the first step. The first step was Steve Witkoff's visit to Moscow. That's the first step. The second step was the phone conversation between Trump and Putin. The third step was Rubio's meeting with Lavrov. The fourth step was the interventions, of J.D. Vance and Hegseth and NATO and in Munich. The fifth step was Trump meeting with Starmer and Macron and Zelensky in the White House, and the explosion in the White House. The sixth step was Europe panicking and frolicking, just foaming in the mouth. And the seventh step was Riyadh meeting. This game didn't start with Rubio meeting with Yermak in Riyadh. That's 7 steps into the game that's been going on, and you can't ignore any of those steps prior, because they all play into what happened. Riyadh did not happen in a vacuum. Riyadh happened as a part of a cause and effect relationship that began the day Witkoff flew to Moscow and met with Vladimir Putin. So, we just have to put everything into perspective, into a balance. And when you look at that timeline I just laid up, you realize how insignificant the meeting was between Rubio and Yermak, how utterly insignificant it is. They accomplished nothing. What happened? Did they stop the fighting? Are the Ukrainians serious negotiators? I mean, the consistency in their position is non-existent. What did they agree to? We don't even know the details of what they agreed to. Rubio talks about this, but Rubio won't even talk about it. Won't talk about a time frame. He won't talk about substance. Was territory put on the table? We know that the Russians have made clear what their conditions are. And Trump, the president of the United States, who outranks Marco Rubio, by the way, has committed to saying that the Russians have a case. And now Rubio's meeting with the Ukrainians, creating a different narrative. Why? Well, it can't be about impressing the Russians. It has to be about trapping Europe, which I think is, again, the immediate predicate to this was the panic in Europe. But we have a ways to go here. And they've always said that. Trump has always said this will be a process, and it could be a lengthy process. The key thing is if Russia says we want to engage in this process. Up until now, Russia hasn't been put in that position because there's no process to engage in. They purposely didn't talk about things, but I think there's a reason why they didn't start with Russia and get the Russian terms. Because now Russia commits to something, they take it, and it's Europe and Ukraine that get to dissect it and say no. The Russians were like, we're here. So they started something. They now are taking that, and as they bring it to Russia, it's falling apart. Whatever they talked about in Riyadh is immediately being contradicted by the insane cocaine-sniffing idiot who runs Ukraine, who's saying, we want all our territory back. Even after Trump has said that ain't going to happen. So how can you take the Ukrainian position seriously? All we know is that Europe says this ceasefire is a good thing. Ball's in Russia's court. And if Russia says, we agree, ceasefire is a good thing, they're playing the game. Now they volley back with real positions that aren't going to change over time. Hard positions that are reality-based, that Europe and Ukraine are going to have to deal with. And the longer Europe and Ukraine then discuss it, the worse things become on the battlefield.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, lastly, if you could comment on this, because I think what a lot of people, and you mentioned this, like the contradictions that we hear often coming out of Trump, the Trump administration, it's just a lot of change constantly in terms of positions and actions. And so I think what a lot of people are kind of bracing for is, well, is this like a prelude to another Minsk? Is this an attempt to pressure Russia via, these moves to move Ukraine toward, in Europe toward this kind of acceptance of peace, and then, embarrass Russia in some way? There seems to be a lot of possibilities that people are wondering about, because what came out of this, while we don't see the terms or anything like that, but what people are reading and what people are hearing is that Ukraine is now back in the good graces of the United States. It has the weapons again. It has the intel. And I think that came as a shock to many people who were saying, well, we've been talking about on the show a long time. Hey, can this conflict be just ended by quickly withdrawing U.S. support for Ukraine? And given that essentially Zelensky is the United States in terms of like how his political legitimacy falls, could it be that the United States under Trump, who's, essentially he likes to be strong, couldn't he just end this and say, let's just be done. Let's go to the Russians. Let's make a deal. What are the pitfalls here? You mentioned some of them. Congress, there's opposition, yes, but what stops Donald Trump then from is he not able, and his administration not able to push forward at a more rapid pace that avoids what many people see as possible pitfalls and contradictions, which could be pointing in a direction away from peace? What's your take?
Well, I think we're ignoring Europe. I mean, I nowhere in you're talking Ukraine, Russia, the United States, but where does Europe factor in? The United States under Biden sucked Europe into this conflict, sucked NATO into this conflict, and they have made extensive political investments in the outcome here. And, when I say careers are on the line, it's politicians' careers, and that's everything. Politicians don't like to lose their career, especially when they consider themselves to be politically viable. These are the ultimate narcissists, and Europe is full of narcissists who are in power right now, who want to stay in power. And they can't acknowledge that they have failed. They have led their nations onto the, in the case of Germany, to literally, they've deindustrialized. They're ruining the economy. France, the same thing, all because of this gamble. And so Europe is desperate to ensure that they retain some sort of relevance. And if Trump does everything that you're talking about, unilaterally putting pressure on Ukraine, unilaterally broking a deal with Russia, what we're in danger of happening is that we come up with an agreement that we have with Russia, but Europe's not in it. And Europe has already said, if the United States wants to disengage, we are prepared to talk about going forward alone, committed to Ukraine. And then you've created an even more complicated problem now, because we can sit here and talk about fantasies about America crushing the French economy and crushing the German economy, and the bottom line is we're not going to do that. We have 80 years of post-war history with Europe that isn't going to get thrown away in a week. We have to get the Europeans on board. That's an absolute essential. We have to get them on board, but we can't do it by inviting to the table straight up with their pre-Trump policies, which, by the way, they were so committed to that they openly collaborate with the Biden administration against Donald Trump when he was a candidate, advocating against him, trying to put their thumb on the scale against Trump. And even after Trump was elected in November, these same players, these partners of America, were working with the Biden administration to Trump-proof the policies that they wanted to continue. And so they are not politically aligned with Trump. There's already a bad feeling here. And if you mismanage this relationship, you could get a divorce that now complicates Trump's strategic objective of getting out of Europe. So Trump has to manage the European problem. Must. And it's a complicated problem. We're dealing with NATO, we're dealing with the European Union, and all the politics that involves. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now isn't so much about Trump. First of all, I think Donald Trump's smart enough to know that he can't pressure Putin. He knows it. If he doesn't know it, then Tulsi Gabbard needs to brief him on this reality. Putin just doesn't do pressure. Whatever leverage Donald Trump thinks he has economically, I have just one factor: 27 million. See, Russia's willing to pay the price for its existential survival. They're not going to buckle just because Donald Trump plays games with oil prices or does some other, financial, manipulation. Russia will commit to this war. The Russian people are fully capable of committing, of suffering, of tightening their belts, of doing what it takes to win. We're not. And Donald Trump, I just think there's a lot of posturing taken there. This isn't about Russia. He has to say things, he has to posture to keep Europe believing that Trump can be a fair broker. Another thing that goes against him unilaterally putting pressure on is, at the end of the day, this deal with Russia has to be broader than just Ukraine. We have to talk about European security, and that's a negotiation. That isn't something that Russia's going to, Russia may have a lot of influence on how the conflict in Ukraine finishes. But Russia doesn't have any inherent right to dictate what a post-conflict European security arrangement is. That's a negotiation. It's not a dictation from Russia. And so Donald Trump is part, these two things are linked. The negotiation to bring an end to the Ukraine conflict will hopefully roll over into a broader negotiation about European security, which, by the way, if you're going to have, you have to have Europe on board. So Europe has to be on board with whatever the Ukrainian peace deal is going to be. We can't just cut Europe out and then talk European security, because the Europeans are going to still be trying to fight the Ukraine war. So Trump has to bring Europe in. That is part of his strategy. And then he has to maintain negotiating leverage over Russia, because it will be a negotiation about European security framework. Trump can't unplug from Europe and go to the Pacific with uncertainty. He needs to nail this down. It has to be solid in writing, something that's not only good for the Russians. And I know a lot of people saying, well, Russia deserves all the good things in the world. Sure. So do we. No, we don't. We started this war. Again, screw you. Donald Trump didn't start this war. He's trying to finish this war. Let's give him credit for making an effort that Joe Biden never would. Do you think Kamala Harris would be doing what Trump's doing right now? Nope. Let's be grateful that we have a president, as imperfect as he is, who's trying to do the right thing. Lead us down a path to bring an end to a war and bring peace and stability to Europe that's been missing for 8 decades. NATO is the problem. That's a larger problem than Ukraine. But how do you bring NATO down? How do you unwind 80 years? It has to be done carefully, diplomatically, and it can't be done by giving away everything to Russia. Russia's going to have to earn some of this. Not about Ukraine, but about NATO, European Security Framework. We don't give anything away. I mean, personally, I'm like, give up those missile defense sites in Poland and Romania. But if I'm a negotiator, the hell I will. Russia's going to pay. You want those gone? We got to get something. You want NATO to fall back to 97 borders? We got to get something. You ain't getting nothing for free. And Trump's a negotiator. And there will be hard negotiations with Russia in a post-Ukraine conflict to establish what a equitable European security framework looks like. I know Russia's drafted up treaties, but those treaties can't be allowed to become dictate. We can't let Russia dictate outcomes to us. We have to look out for our best interests and the interests of our European friends and allies, as long as they remain our friends and allies. And we have to have hard-nosed negotiations with the Russians. That doesn't mean that we're enemies and we're going to war. It's a negotiation to achieve peace, an equitable, peaceful outcome. So it's a good negotiation. This isn't a negotiation that if it fails, we go to war. If it fails, we just have an incomplete peace in Europe. But this is the direction Trump's going down. And I think, everybody's like, oh man, I wish there was more structure. I wish there was more, predictability. If you had that, you'd have a different president. We got to where we're at right now because we have a president unlike any president we've ever had. A president who's willing to break the paradigms, willing to break decades of, precedent, willing to say what we were doing isn't good. We're going to try something different. So I'm all in favor of giving Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt and giving as much support as possible to get this thing moved down the road. And I'm going to be taking a deep breath as I go forward every time Trump does something stupid, or at least what appears to be stupid in my book, and go, why don't you sleep on it, Ritter? Take a deep breath and re-examine it in the morning. Because if you do, you might see that there's more nuance and more complexity in it than just a knee-jerk black and white Trump sucks kind of thing.
I definitely think there is complexity. And maybe I definitely want to get to Kursk soon, but I think one of the concerns about this complexity, Scott, that I'm hearing from others, and I also share, is that the interests of the United States, what are they here when it comes to European security, when it comes to relations with Russia? Because the interests of the United States toward Russia and how it deals with Russia has historically been, and we can say, okay, Trump is different right now. We don't have an outcome though yet, so we can't necessarily say we know that there's something happening here, but we don't know exactly what's going to come out of it. But given what we've known about how the U.S. has dealt with Russia, as you so well know, Scott, is the concern here is that these interests that we're talking about, this hardball negotiations, is that the United States, Trump, or whoever else is advising him, people who have interests in this broader conflict with Russia, that it's their interests that are going to be satisfied in hardball negotiations, and that could very well lead to, as you said, imperfect or maybe even a failed attempt at peace. And I think that's where the concern is when we see the optics and the theater and everything that's going on, the various positions, the stupid things that he says. But truthfully, the process itself being drawn out and elongated, and there be kind of back and forths that look so different from each other and how Trump behaves, I think it's understandable. I don't share the panic. I am also wanting to see what happens, but I see where people are coming from when they're
but Danny, let me push back here. Drawn out. He hasn't been president 2 months. How can you draw anything out in 2 months? In fact, if you look at it, it's extraordinarily accelerated. Extraordinarily accelerated. There's nothing drawn out. He's not dragging anything out. This is accelerated, accelerated, accelerated. And what interests? I mean, let's just acknowledge that maybe if we we're looking to simplistically define what the old establishment interests, the vectors were. Could we identify USAID as one of those interest vectors?
Yeah.
Oh, not just yes, Danny. Hell yes. A leading vector. It's gone, destroyed, finished, boom. NED, National Endowment for Democracy, the tippy spear of regime change, the establishment's bad boy of rock and roll. Gone. Danny, this is a revolution. This isn't gamemanship. This isn't posturing. In 2 months, he has knocked down the foundations of decades of American foreign policy establishment. Knocked it out. Finished it. Boom. Why doesn't he get any credit for that? 2 months. He hasn't dragged anything out. He's knocking everybody in the face, headbutting them down. It pisses a lot of people off. A lot of people are unhappy about that, and I understand it. But the one thing you can't say about Donald Trump is that he's faking it. What establishment interest has he? We could, because everybody go, well, the Zionists, Scott. Yeah, that's Gaza. Let's keep that the hell out of the argument about Russia. When we talk about Europe, the entire establishment is in a panic. Have you seen any good articles coming out of the Atlantic magazine lately about Trump? Nope. And they've managed the transatlantic relationship. If you see anything good coming out of foreign affairs, the Council of Foreign Relations, rag, nope. Why? Because he's challenging everything. There isn't a single pillar of the establishment that's happy about what Donald Trump is doing. Look at the military-industrial complex. Their billions come in by selling F-35s to Europe. What Trump is doing with all of this is getting Europeans to shut down military contracts with the United States. Does Trump care? Hell no, because this is a revolution. This is revolutionary, what's happening here. And people need to understand, we are 2 months into a presidency, and he has accomplished more to disrupt the old establishment than anybody could have possibly imagined. And where we are right now with Russia on these negotiations is so damn accelerated. We are so far down the path. You don't get this far to start from scratch with nothing and to be where you are right now, having phone calls with Putin. Meanwhile, he's going to be meeting with Xi Jinping in China. So he is a man who's capable of juggling a couple things at once too. We got to give Trump a little bit of credit. We don't have to agree with his methodologies because we don't understand his methodologies. I sure as hell don't. But one thing I have done is just try and find out what template do I overlay. I mean, that's what you do in the intelligence business is you just keep overlaying templates to see which one makes sense. What's the enemy going to do? Let's do this template. Let's do that template. With Trump, there's only one template that I can apply, and that's The Apprentice. I just keep telling people, go back and watch. I forget how many seasons there were, 13, 15 seasons of The Apprentice. You don't have to watch them all, but watch the early ones especially. Watch how Trump operates, deliberately setting people against people, creating chaos, test people, test theories, all leading to a culminating moment, which only he knows going in. I think Trump has a plan. He has a vision. He's not sharing it with people because that's not his style. And what he's doing right now is doing The Apprentice. He's identifying weak points. I think Keith Kellogg is a prime example of that. His big boy, the Ayatollah of rock and roll, he was going to be right there advising Trump all the way. He's my man. He's going to be my negotiator. I'm building everything based upon what Keith Kellogg told me. And yet Keith Kellogg, when the time came in The Apprentice to perform, failed. And you know what Trump did? You're fired. Marco Rubio may be on the chopping block. Let's see how he performs. Michael Waltz may on Trump. Trump doesn't have any loyalty here. Trump is loyal to one man and one man only, and that's Donald Trump. You either perform or you get fired. And I think that's where we're at right now. He is accelerating. This is an accelerated process. His job is to put you under stress, to make you operate under stress. That's what he did in The Apprentice. And I think that's what he's doing today. But I just think the proof is in the pudding, and you don't want to crown him. Well, we never want to crown him king. He's the president, but you don't want to put the medal around his neck until he's earned it.
Right.
And he won't earn it until he accomplishes the tasks that he set out to accomplish. But I get really irritated when people start sniping at him right now, and throwing up artificial paradigms, dragging it out. You can't drag anything out when you're 2 months into a presidency and you've been going 110 miles an hour. There's no dragging out. Oh, the deep state is secretly. He's destroyed the deep state. Tell me which deep state you're talking about when you want to come in and say somebody's dictating to Donald Trump. He's not taking advice from any of them. He brought in all outsiders except Marco Rubio, who he sort of kept off. I don't know if you look, I don't want to get into psychology 101 here, but I spent a lot of time interrogating a lot of people over the years, and we learned how to look at body language. Did you see Marco Rubio in the White House when Trump and J.D. Vance were tag teaming Zelensky? He was a defeated man. Defeated man. He was just defeated. He wasn't engaged. He didn't do this. He wasn't there. He wasn't looking. He was a defeated man because he's not a player. He's not a player at all. He has a role to play. He had no role to play in that. He's now doing something. It's a gamble what he's doing. How much latitude was he given to work with the Ukrainians? What happens if he overplayed his hand? And now Trump speaks to Putin on Friday and finds out that Rubio played his hand wrong. Rubio's being sent to the G7. Rubio's not going to be in Moscow. The Secretary of State is not going to be at the most important meeting that's going to be taking place in the world on that day. Instead, he's going to be holding hands at a failed institution, the G7. So I think already we're seeing signs that Rubio is not succeeding. I don't want to predict the future, except to say that if I'm betting, I think, the "you're fired" sign could be coming Marco Rubio's way, definitely by midterm, but maybe even sooner than that. Donald Trump is playing a game that I think most people out there don't understand. I can't pretend to understand. I try to understand, but I don't think people even are willing to try. As soon as I hear somebody overlay the American template, well, the U.S. interests. What U.S. interests are you talking about? Joe Biden's interest? He ain't president anymore. The deep state? They're destroyed. Who? Donald Trump's interests. That's the only interests that matter. Now, there are some transatlanticists and stuff in there. He has to deal with Europe and all that, and he's working on that. I think he may have set a trap for Europe. My evidence, the ball's in Putin's court, repeated 426 times.
Right. Well, I'll just state my assessment. I think it's a very good point. The speed that you mentioned, the things are happening very rapidly. For me, though, how I generally look at U.S. politics is I am very cautious, and I that's why I'm in agreement with you. Wait and see for the outcome in many respects. It's on this question because for me, a lot of U.S. politics, especially over the last several decades, has been about how to be the most effective at achieving. You said, what are U.S. interests? Well, I think the biggest ones that kind of drive policy are what are the interests of Wall Street? What are the interests of the military industrial complex? What are the interests of these big players that actually determine much of what politicians do? And you mentioned, let's separate Gaza. But I think it's important to mention that Donald Trump has a lot of money coming from the Adelsons, a lot of money from AIPAC. That does influence policy. We will see how that all. I know there's a lot of contradictions to this, and I've actually been interested in the whole Hamas talks, and how Trump is going to navigate all of this, given that it is a powder keg that could sink his administration. So I see a lot of opportunities also for potential there. But at the same time, these are the interests that I'm talking about. And the concern is that, a lot of these fast moves that had been made, a lot of these things, I think they're significant. I think going over the NED, the USAID, I think they have been significant. I think there have been real things happening there. But there's also a possibility I'm leaving open so that down the road, we are ready for potential shockwaves that happen a lot in U.S. politics when we see politicians do things one time and then another thing happens another, is that we've heard Ruby, we heard the Department of State say that they are absorbing USAID, that there is still going to be certain operations that are kept. And we don't know what those are, but we know that they're kept. So I'm holding out caution only because we don't know what's happening with Russia just yet. We know that there has been, I look at these as positive steps like you, Scott, for sure. Positive steps for peace. I would never criticize talks. I think they're important. The way they go about, how they go about, and what the outcome is, I'm still holding criticism only because I'm hoping that American people in the United States will keep that critical eye so that they are ready if the Trump administration fails to say, no, this is actually what we wanted. And we need to get it because it is existential for us. It means a lot to us that, our money, we're struggling here. The early Trump administration economic policies haven't been so wildly successful in improving people's lives. I'm not saying that's just Trump. I'm saying that's every U.S. Political administration, presidential administration for the last several decades. That's how it's been. So I'm holding out caution. But I just wanted to say that because we have a lot to go. We have a phone call in a couple of days that we have to see how what happens from that. And I'm glad that we can have these conversations. But you can of course address any of that, Scott. But I definitely want to talk to you about this fascinating Kursk operation. So maybe if you wanted to briefly just say it.
No. Look, Danny, American citizenship's all about holding those whom we elect to higher office accountable for what they do in our name. And this is doubly so if you voted for Donald Trump. I did. And therefore, I own him. I'm responsible. And there's no free ride. I'm not somebody who sits there and you know me. I mean, if I think you're screwing up, I'll say you're screwing up because that's my duty. That's my job as an American citizen. I'm not here to be a rubber stamp or a doormat. And I think you're absolutely correct to everybody should, first of all, we need to set high standards.
Exactly. Expectations are so low. I mean, they're so low right now. Anyway, continue.
And we need to hold the people whom we elect not only accountable to what our standards are, but more importantly, because if you voted for this guy, you voted for a platform. You voted for a mission statement that he said. What's he doing to accomplish the mission that he said he was going to do? He has to be held accountable to that. So it's about accountability of process, the promised process, and results. And like you, I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, no, Donald Trump gets to do whatever he wants to do. As I told you, I don't know if you read my post just yesterday, or maybe even this morning. Hell, I don't know. Maybe, I think it was yesterday. 2 angry posts, very critical of Donald Trump and Russia, because when I saw Rubio and Waltz speak in Riyadh, I was just furious. I felt betrayed.
So was I.
And then my wife gave me great advice. Go to bed. Stop tweeting. Get that damn phone out of your head. Stop tweeting and go to bed. Wake up in the morning, take the dogs for a walk, drink a couple Diet Cokes, calm down, and then reassess the situation. And when I did that, I was like, there's got to be another game going on here, something else. So I'm with you all on board about holding people to account. We're on the same team. It's called being a good citizen.
Right. Yeah. And, there's plenty of things I know they don't follow the scope so much of this program that Trump is doing that, I go to the grocery store. I'm like, damn, I'm going to pay $12 for eggs today. And nothing's really happening right now. Come on, man. That's got to go a little faster. But in any event, Scott, I do want to hear, maybe we
notice there's things about Donald Trump's presidency that I don't talk about. because
I mean, we could go on and on about
oh,
that,
God,
and
my hair
economic policy.
it
It's
turns
just,
silver if I start talking about because I just
of
stick to the
course.
things that I have some background in, and I feel comfortable talking about. The other stuff, I'm like you. I'm just like,
Right,
I
right.
mean,
I'll
freedom of speech, the arrest of this
uh,
the kill. This is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. It's just
disgusting.
disgusting.
The
And
precedent too, Scott. Like it reminds me of the old Cold War.
it's horrible,
Just
horrible.
yeah,
And he hasn't committed a crime. They start off by saying, because at first I was like, well, if the guy broke the law, I mean, come on. I mean, I know these demonstrations and all that. If you're on territory trespassing, but if he broke the law, strictly speaking, I guess I wasn't happy with it because I think it's but it turns out he hasn't broken any laws. He's obeyed every law. He's done nothing wrong except be critical of American foreign policy. And because Marco Rubio now has determined that he has been critical of American foreign policy, we're going to treat him like he's a criminal, like he's a terrorist. This is horrible, disgusting. And if you believe in free speech, you can't support this at all. And Trump claims to believe in free speech. This is one of those contradictions that.
and then he goes on, Truth Social and X and says, "Oh well, if you say this and you do that, if you exert your free speech rights like this, then you're an enemy. Shalom, shalom. You're an enemy." I'm just like, why that? You say it's like you are really feeding red meat to the Zionist demographic.
Yeah, I mean,
here.
this is
It's disgusting. I mean, well, I do want to talk about the Middle East at the end. Let's try to break this up. Let's try to see if we can get this on 40 minutes, 20 minutes ish. Kursk, we of course shorter if needed, and then 20 minutes. I want to close on the Middle East because Sky, I did want your take from the military perspective of what happened in Kursk. This absolutely stunning operation that began this, or at least it put a real spotlight on Russia's what was being called the counteroffensive in some media outlets. But this drive by Russia to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk has absolutely accelerated. At the meeting with Gerasimov, it's something like 86% has been liberated. It's likely in the coming weeks that's going to close even further, quite dramatically. Talk about that operation, though, the tunnel operation through the gas pipeline that Ukraine actually shot itself in the foot in shutting down. But talk about what happened there, your perspective militarily, and then broader, what is happening in Kursk and what's going to be the fallout.
Well, this was an operation that was apparently planned for months. An opportunity was seen. People were looking at the battlefield creatively. There we go. And somebody looked at that pipeline and went, "We can do something with this." But now, when you're going to do something, understand that nothing happens in a vacuum. So that means that they had the pipeline. They were timing it out, how long this will take to get this in, to get the forces in, to get them trained up, to get them into their objective. And then what do we have to shape the battlefield? That's what the people oftentimes forget to realize, is that this operation doesn't take place in a vacuum. That when you want to pull the trigger on putting 800 men in the rear area of the Ukrainians, what conditions have to exist on the battlefield to maximize that effort, which means that you need to stress the Ukrainians so that they have put maximum effort into containing your advances so that they don't have any ability to contain this operation, so that you have an immediate collapse of cohesion and morale, and the battlefield deflates instantly, and you get this result. Because without this, the Ukrainians were simply going to fall back in on prepared positions in Suzda and defend block by block by block by block and make the Russians destroy a Russian city. That was the goal and objective of the Ukrainians. Make the Russians destroy a Russian city. That's what they were going to do. So this operation was designed to prevent that. But in order to do that every attack that has to take place, the timing of it and what you're trying to achieve, you need to get the Ukrainians to commit reserves. So, you have to overcommit on an area to get those reserves committed there. and you have to time everything. You don't want to move too fast here because then these reserves that you want here go here. You need to do everything in coordination with this, a very timed, phased operation to get the Ukrainians where you want them to be at the moment that these guys come out in the rear. The pipeline thing, I mean, this is it's a work of military genius, and it's an engineering feat. I guess when the Russians first considered using the pipeline, they went to the gas engineers and said, how do we do this? And all the gas engineers, the guys who built the pipeline operator, went, you can't. We can't purge that. That's poison gas in there. And the Russians were like, well, we got to do that. So they brought in the military guys. And the military guys went in there and they did it. I mean, they had to get SCBAs, the self-contained breathing apparatus, and had guys come in and basically, use fans and purge the gas out. And then you have to inject oxygen in. When they first did it, it didn't work. The initial teams that went in, apparently these guys passed out, went into comas, and had to be pulled out and resuscitated. And they've survived. To show you what kind of courage these guys have, they went into the pipeline. They damn near they poisoned themselves, suffocated, went into seizures, panic, heart attack, brought back to life. And when they get out of the hospital, straight back into the pipeline to continue the job, because they're all volunteers. This is what they want to do. They knew the history that they were making and the cause that they were supporting. And this is 15 kilometers. Now, I do Spartan racing, not bragging. I used to do it a lot, but my knees don't work anymore. But, Spartan racing, you're going to go, 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers is the max. 15 kilometers is hard, standing straight up. These guys did 15 kilometers, 1.4 meters. That means that they're bending over, they're leaning down, and they're going in. And as they go, you have to bring in water. You have to bring in food. I love talking to Zombie, who's the head of Wagner's 3rd assault detachment. Now he's with the Akhmat Special Forces with Abdi Aladanov. Toilets. You got 800 guys in a pipe. I don't want to get too graphic here, but they're eating, they're drinking, and their bodies still work. And so you've got to have everything in there. It becomes sort of a 15-kilometer city with people moving through. And then they get to the end where they're waiting at the end. And at the end, they didn't do it perfectly. The air, the oxygen is not what it needs to be at the end. So the guys are in there and they're having a hard time breathing. And they have to wait 4 days to get everything lined up, to get everything ready, get all the units in to monitor how the Ukrainians are responding. And then on the 4th day, up they come. And you look at the videos when they first come out, they ain't walking too well. Why? Because they are oxygen deprived. They're sitting there tired. They've been in this damn trench 4 days waiting, and they come out and they're a little shaky and all that. They went in, they seized their objectives. They got in the rear area of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians went, we got nothing. And they quit. Suzda belongs to Russia right now. I think that the last I heard is it has fallen. All the Ukrainians just dropped their weapons and ran because they lost the will to fight, because the Russian presence in their rear demoralized them so much, threw them off. It disrupted everything, command and control, logistics. And the units on the front line went, the Russians in our rear, we've got no. And they quit. This is a genius operation. It saved literally tens of thousands of lives, including Ukrainian lives. It saved a city from total destruction. And it saved Russian lives. I mean, the Russians would have lost hundreds, if not thousands, of people trying to liberate this place. And it threw the Ukrainians in total disarray. And now the Russians will continue to press their attacks. That's what Putin was telling Gerasimov, to continue to press, not only to liberate Kursk, but to keep pushing the Ukrainians back into Sumy and build a buffer zone. The Ukrainians are in trouble right now, because if you study military history, when you have collapse of this nature, especially against an enemy, a foe, an opponent that is going to continue the pressure, you can't recover. You don't get to fall back. This was not a planned retreat. This is a collapse, which means they don't have sufficient forces in the rear area to build a new line. And when they tried to bring them up, I don't know what the number was, 15 Iskander missiles hit Sumy today as the Ukrainians tried to bring in forces, and the missiles rained down and destroyed them. And the Russians are going to keep going. This will go down in history as one of the most significant battles of modern warfare. Definitely a game changer. It's going to be up there with the Battle of Bakhmut. It's going to be up there with the siege of Mariupol. It's going to be up there with the battles around Robotyno in the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. These are all battles that we studied by military historians for years to come. But this one, the pipeline, you're not going to be able to replicate the pipeline. I mean, that's a unique aspect of the geography. But the overall military concepts here of preparing the battlefield, the psychological impact of it, people talk about raids and how a raid can have importance, to alter this thing. Again, that's just to tell the war story. When I was in the Marines in the lead up to the Gulf War, I was pulled out of amphibious warfare school and sent to this special planning cell run by Major General Caulfield under orders of the Commandant, General Gray. And our job was to plan amphibious operations that gave the Marine commander in the theater options other than 2 divisions online, hey diddle diddle, straight up the middle frontal assault against Iraqi defensive positions in the Wafra oil fields, which is what General Schwarzkopf was saying. And there were 2 operations that I put together. One was a corps level amphibious assault on Al Faw Peninsula standard, bring in multiple Marine divisions and assault through the Al Faw, get to Al Zubair, put the Republican Guard in the horns of a dilemma. Do they stay in place? Do they pivot? If they pivot, then the Army, 7th Corps comes in, you trap them, you annihilate them, battle annihilation, all this. But the other one was a raid. And I basically was talking about taking a light armored vehicle battalion and do a combined amphibious and helicopter raid where you land, you immediately come into Al Zubair Command and Control Center, disrupt it, attack it, destroy everything, and then withdraw. But what I told the people when I briefed it, I said, there's a chance, if this is done right, that you can break the entire Kuwaiti or Iraqi will to resist. That if we time this right with the proper preparation, having these Marines show up in the rear area, doing what they do, the Iraqis at the front line will collapse. We have to be prepared when this raid happens to exploit that, to immediately push them back. That same psychology is what the Russians did in Suja. They put 800 men in the rear area of a superior Ukrainian force, and they broke the Ukrainian will to resist. I would really like to study the intelligence that was put together by the Russians about this, the psychological health of the Ukrainian military. What factors were being evaluated because you have different units. So in which units need to have what pressure put on them, et cetera, because the psychology of war is what helps you win battles. And I think this one will go down in history. The Suja event will go down in history as, probably one of the most successful psychological operations ever run, because that's what it was. You were putting 800 guys in the rear, compelling the enemy to panic and causing the collapse of the Ukrainian position.
And remember how this began, Scott. It began with the narrative and with the operation itself being framed as the exact opposite, that Ukraine was the one seizing the initiative, that Ukraine had stuck it in the eye of Russia, and that Ukraine had a bargaining chip at the table. Now we're looking at this, and the entire narrative has changed. While Trump will say, oh, well, a lot of Russians are dying. It's true. There are a good number of Russians that are dying, but no one is saying that there, or at least fewer and fewer, those who are not being listened to as hard, are saying that Russia is militarily being defeated or on the, on the ropes or anything like that. And I think Kursk, this operation was, especially in the context of what's happening now with U.S.-Russia talks, it's just blown away. It completely exploded this whole entire narrative.
Yeah, it's the one of the problems with the narrative creation is who's writing the narrative and who's driving it. I've been guided in this whole Kursk operation by the reactions of one man, and that's Abdi Aladanov. Now, there's a personal reason. I've met him several times. I like him, and we are in infrequent contact. He's a frontline commander and a Russian general, and I'm a former Marine intelligence officer, so it's not like he's sending me secrets. But I follow him. He is a master at public relations. The Russians aren't very good at public relations. Abdi Aladanov is a master at it. But he was sent right from the start. He and the Akhmat Special Forces were sent along with a Marine brigade, I think the 810th and maybe the 11th Airborne Brigade were sent in to contain this Ukrainian operation. And again, I've met him, I know him, and so I watched him, and I'm looking for signs of stress, strain, panic. The man never blinked. He was honest. He would say we had a tough day today, or he'd say, things are tough. The Ukrainians are pushing forward, but we're doing this. We have to adjust. We have to do this. But never once did he panic or lose resolve. And then I just watched as they stopped the attacks, and I watched as he assembled his forces and he briefed his forces and he directed this war. And he was one of the men who planned this attack. There's a video out there of him giving a pep talk to the Akhmat Special Forces before they enter the pipeline and go in and carry out this thing. He is one of the people who conceived this. And he's the guy that I've been watching the whole time. And, that's why I've never, ever once, said, Ukraine got the upper hand here. I've always said they're going to lose. And the reason why they're going to lose is that I'm looking at the guy who's going to make them lose. And I know him. And I'm seeing a man with no panic, totally at calm with the situation, confident in the outcome, and just waiting because he knew what Russia was about to. Like I said, this plan for this pipeline is several months old. So, if you go back in time a couple months, the Ukrainians are like, we're going to hold on to Kursk. And people are like, well, the Russians will never take Kursk back. Remember that, Danny? I mean, I'm talking about in January. People say the Russians will never take Kursk back. Look, they haven't managed to do it. Well, in January, the Russians were planning exactly this. The Russians have been in charge of the pace of this operation from day one because they are in control. I've talked about the OODA loop several times. Getting inside the enemy's decision-making cycle. The Russians have owned the decision-making cycle in Kursk from the the Ukrainians took the Russians by surprise. Abdi said that right off the bat. He said they took us by surprise. There's some failures here that we're going to have to deal with, and we're responding to a very difficult situation. So the Ukrainians, controlled that decision-making cycle early on, but eventually they ran out of troops. And so they stopped. The Russians contained it. And then once the Russians achieved an equilibrium, they began taking the initiative. They were acting. The Ukrainians are now reacting. And once you get into that, once you are doing nothing but reacting to what your opponent's doing, they're driving the operation. They're shaping the battlefield. And Russia's been shaping this thing for many, many months now. And they've been trying to achieve just this outcome several months ago. Several months ago, this operation was conceived. The Russians had that vision. While everybody else was sitting there going, the Ukrainians got this great negotiating position. The Russians will never take Kursk. Look how slow they are. For all you people that are big arrow people, going, well, look, if the Russians continue to advance at the rate that they're doing right now, it'll take them 46 years and 400,000 troops to retake Kursk. Well, you don't know a damn thing about war if you said that. Because you don't understand attritional warfare, you don't understand correlation of forces, you don't understand the concept of, reaching a culminating point where collapse is inevitable. The Russians understood it. They've shaped the whole battlefield to achieve just this point. And that's the genius of this operation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was seeing those videos of the tunnel in particular, when these guys are walking through it, I when I was in Vietnam, I went to the Coochie tunnels right outside of
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh City, and they just keep some kind of like renovated demonstrations that they've kept alive to show people what life was like, because people lived in those tunnels to fight the French, the U.S., etc. But even just being in one of those, coming in and out for 10 to 15, 20 feet, grueling in terms of just physically, like it's physically demanding. So to see 12 kilometers or something absolutely, just something absolutely incredible, that be taken on in complete darkness, the gas, everything. It's just shocking for especially for someone like me and maybe others who have been following this, because uh, the narrative has been Russia is just pouring bodies in. They don't care about anything. They are simply expansionist. All of this is withering away when Russia makes these huge moves. So maybe to close, Scott, what will you say Kursk will go into history as one of the most important military operations of this conflict? What will not only Kursk, but we're coming to the end game. So maybe in 2 minutes or less, what will this conflict teach us once it's all over? Because the end is, we've been saying this for a couple years now, but we truly are at the end game, it appears. So what will the end of this teach, especially us, those who watch this, majority US European viewers?
Well, let me start off by saying that I think one of the strategies of the United States in its negotiating position is to ensure that this war doesn't end with a total Russian victory, because you've got no leverage at that point in time. I mean, if Russia has achieved all its objectives, driven the Ukrainians back, what is there to negotiate? I mean, Russia now has literally not just dictated the outcome; they've made the outcome inevitable. And so that's why we want a ceasefire, is because we want, if Russia is going to be given constitutional Russia, we would like it to happen by having the Ukrainians withdraw on their own volition from that territory, because that's a action that then we can ask for a reaction. We can get something from the Russians. But if this thing collapses and the Russians just get it, we don't have any leverage. We've got nothing. And what we're looking at here is that there's a real possibility that by the summer, Russia is going to get everything it wants, that the Ukraine isn't going to be able to sustain this. They've put up effective resistance at Kursk. I've seen Ukrainian bloggers talking about how they stopped the Russians there, and they're pushing back in limited counterattacks in Toretsk and other places, but they don't have the troops to sustain it. And Russia will simply outflank. Russia is going to be pushing into Sumy right now. And what that's going to do is compel Ukraine to divert resources from the front to Sumy to contain it, to prevent a deep penetration. And when that happens, you're going to see the rapid collapse of whatever sectors where they pull those troops from. And you can hold on to Pokrovsk all you want, but if the Russians come in from the north and come in from the south and start to encircle you, you got to leave Pokrovsk. And this is what we're going to see. The Ukrainians can't hold on to every place at once. They don't have sufficient forces to reinforce and counterattack. And the Russians are just going to achieve collapse after collapse after collapse. And I think you're going to see the Russians start to take the front apart sector by sector by sector, applying the same operational theory that we saw in Kursk, not necessarily the pipelines, but the concept of playing psychological warfare, putting pressure on units and creating a situation where it's unsustainable and morale collapses and the troops pull back in a state of panic, and the Russians exploit that. And once that happens simultaneously in several sectors, it's total collapse, total retreat. And so I think we are truly looking at a competing timelines of the inevitable Russian military victory and this negotiation. And I think the United States will have leverage on the Ukrainians to say, don't screw around, because this is going to happen. we can't stop what the Russians are going to do by putting pressure on Russia. It can only stop if you allow it to stop by agreeing to the terms that are going to happen no matter what. No matter what, these terms are going to happen. You don't have a say. Agree to them up front, and we can try and mitigate the long-term damage. We can try and talk about, controlling the future of Ukraine. But if there's a collapse on the battlefield, we've got nothing. And then when the Russians say that they want to take control of the elections and they're going to put their own man in and all this stuff, we got nothing. We have no way to push back. But if we say you'll withdraw, and then we'll have elections that will be, overseen by people to, deny Russia the ability to totally control the outcome. So I think that's where the United States is approaching this problem with the Ukrainians. Zelensky's the problem. And I think the other thing that we're going to be seeing here is at some point in time in the near future, I don't think Zelensky will be the president of Ukraine much longer. I think it's widely recognized that he's the problem, not the solution. And that'll especially be manifest after this meeting come Friday, when I personally believe that the Trump administration is going to make a pivot back towards the Russian position. The ball's in Russia's court.
Oh yeah, Scott. Let's quickly react. I wanted your take on just a couple of Middle East, Gaza related, Gaza too. And then maybe we can do a rapid fire. Some of these questions are coming in. You can do rapid 60-second or less kind of a, well, I don't think you do. On Ask the Inspector, I think you get a couple minutes. You might have to do even quicker.
I'll try 60. I'll try 60.
I won't have a timer, but I'll try to keep you to it. All right, let's talk about this, Scott, because it's going to go under the radar with a lot of the talk about Ukraine, understandably taking up the headlines because the media is cautiously looking at what's going to happen there. But, what we've had in March with Israel is in Gaza, they've conducted a horrific blockade of aid, which has led to Ansar Allah coming back to their blockade of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Arabian Sea, this area that for over a year they were blocking Israeli and Israeli-related shipping, which had a huge effect on Israel's economy. And then, of course, you have this, and I saw you comment on X about this, Scott. You also have the Iran situation, how Trump is dealing with Iran. There's this letter that was circulated to Iran, which had an ultimatum to Iran, which read, "There's two ways to go about this, Iran. We can negotiate, essentially on U.S. terms, Trump's terms, or war is coming to Iran." And Pezeshkian and the Ali Khamenei has both said, we're not going to address you, the United States, or negotiate with you under threats. So, Scott, talk about the situation right now, because you have Israel kind of going, there's a ceasefire. There are talks going on between Trump, Hamas, Israel quite frequently. But there's a powder keg going on, and we've talked a lot about Israel's situation. But react to this. React to the overall situation. The Ansar Allah coming back to defend Gaza and the risk of broader war once again reigniting.
Well, I mean, this is a problem. Ansar Allah has shown that it's not intimidated by American military power. I don't know why Donald Trump believes that U.S. aircraft dropping American-made bombs on Houthi targets in Yemen, that somehow the dynamic changes if it's done under Biden or Trump. It's Ansar Allah will take it. What are we going to do? Fly a couple B-52s over and drop, bombs from a B-52? That Ansar Allah could care less. I just remind people that Ansar Allah uses what are called mobile relocatable targets. These are mobile missiles that move around to strike these targets in the ocean. And I'm a veteran of a counter Scud campaign against Iraq during the first Gulf War, when we were looking for these mobile relocatable targets in the expanse of the Western Iraqi desert, and we weren't able to ever find, fix, and destroy a single Iraqi Scud launcher. And that's when we had thousands of sorties diverted for this cause. We had Delta Force on the ground, the SAS on the ground, and we weren't able to achieve anything. 0 kills. Trump is talking about peace in the Middle East, and now Nasrallah is doing this. How is Trump going to shut this thing down? If he accelerates, we may see Iran provide assistance and Trump may say that's justification to strike Iran. Just want to remind people that Iran is prepared to carry out an Operation True Promise 3, which will be absolutely devastating for Israel. And they have the potential to expand True Promise 3 to take out every American installation in the Middle East. Donald Trump knows this because the last time he was president, he was threatening to bomb Iran, and the Pentagon briefed him on what the Iranian response would be and what it would take for the United States to position itself to effectively deal with that. Mass mobilization of American military power, hundreds of thousands of personnel surged into the area over the course of months and years, and still no guarantee of victory as the outcome. Nothing's changed. So if Donald Trump wants to avoid conflict, he needs to consider the easiest way out of this. Because just ask yourself, how did we get Nasrallah to stop its last campaign? It wasn't because we bombed them into submission. It's because of the ceasefire. When the ceasefire went in place, Nasrallah said one of our condition was a ceasefire. So they stopped. Donald Trump needs to rapidly put pressure on Israel to lift this aid embargo, get the aid flowing back in, and you just solved the Nasrallah problem. You've taken that problem off the table, which now simplifies the next issue, which is Iran. The only thing I can think, again, because I can't believe that Trump is just so stupid as to think he could threaten the Iranians into submission. I think his letter was designed to get the reaction it got, which then effectively closes down the direct U.S.-Iran negotiation, which was probably going to be problematic for Trump and for the Iranians. And it opens the door for Russian-Iranian negotiations, Chinese-Iranian negotiations on behalf of the United States, saying, Russia will say, look, in order to, de-escalate, these things need to happen. Iran hasn't said they're not willing to discuss the issue of denuclearization or their nuclear program. They just said they're not willing to do it under the threat of a gun from the United States. And so maybe what Trump is doing is taking America, off the chessboard directly, and then using the art of the indirect approach to get Russia to help. And this is one of the things that Trump and Putin talked about in their 90-minute phone call. And I'm going to guess that it's going to be something that Steve Witkoff, who is the Middle East negotiator, is going to be discussing with Putin as well, together with Trump in their 90-minute phone call. There's going to be a broader discussion than simply Ukraine, because the U.S.-Russian relationship is going to be broader than this. And I think we're also going to see that in April, when Trump goes and speaks with China, that we're going to be talking about not just normalization of economic relations, but talking about, normalization of diplomatic relations, how we can leverage the Chinese into doing things that are beneficial to the United States, the region, and the world. In this case, bringing Iran's nuclear program under, effective control so that Israel doesn't have to worry about a breakout scenario towards an Iranian nuclear weapon that's measured in days to get it back to that 1 year breakout window. That the potential is there. Russia's saying, we're going to build your reactors and provide you the fuel. That takes away, any legitimate reason for Iran to retain the complete fuel cycle of uranium enrichment. This is a lot of speculation right now, but that letter doesn't make any sense, because it's literally a letter designed to terminate negotiation potential. And anybody writing that letter knew that, would advise the president. So I think the president knew that going in. And I don't believe he's looking for a war, because a war would lead to major energy security disruptions. I mean, the oil market would collapse, the price would go through the roof. Whatever Trump's trying to achieve economically here in the United States would be over. And this oil crisis would last for years. And so there would be no recovering from this. So this would be the end of the Trump revolution. It would be the end of Trump's presidency, because in 2 years, I don't think the Republicans would hold on to the House under these circumstances. And then that breathes life into a, right now, which is a moribund Democratic Party. The Democrats are now back to life, and they can challenge in 2028. And the idea of a 12 to 20 year MAGA, empire, whatever you want to hell you call it, is gone. Trump would be committing suicide to have a conflict with Iran in the Middle East. He knows this because he's done this before. He's been briefed on it. So I have to believe that basically there's a purpose behind this letter, which was to take America, to eliminate the need for America to be the one, for Trump to be the one negotiating with the Iranians, and instead allow the initial phases of this negotiation to take place using Russian and Chinese proxies, not because that they're working for us, but because we're going to try, especially in the case of Russia, to revive our diplomatic relations. We've seen unprecedented cooperation. We saw the United States voting with Russia against an anti-Russian resolution in the United Nations. We see the United States and Russia meeting at the Security Council on Friday to discuss Syria. These are things that haven't happened since 1991 in terms of America and the and the Russians or the Soviets working together. And I think this is hopefully the direction we're going, because otherwise, this talk about peace in the Middle East is just empty talk. And I don't believe it's empty talk. I truly believe that Trump wants peace in the Middle East because, again, like with Europe, we have to disentangle ourselves from these economic and military commitments to a region that aren't to our benefit. We need stability in the region. We need the region to be working together in sync, so that we can go to the Pacific and deal with the huge issue of China. And I don't mean deal militarily. I mean to make sure that we have the resources that we can have not just effective diplomacy, but counter. I mean, again, China went to the Cook Islands. Why? Because there's a vacuum there. Nobody in the West went to the Cook Islands. China went to the Cook Islands and did an agreement that includes deep sea mining of these polymetallic nodules. Why aren't we doing that? Because we stopped doing diplomacy in the Pacific, meaningful diplomacy. We stopped looking at it from the economic standpoint. Why did the Chinese get to go to the Solomon Islands and enter there? Because America stopped doing diplomacy. As soon as the Chinese went in, we sent a diplomat back in to re-engage. But it can't just be one diplomat, opening up an embassy and doing nothing. We need to put resources behind it. And right now, those resources are tied up in Europe and the Middle East, because both those areas are leading militarily. I don't think we want to lead militarily in the Pacific, but if we're going to lead diplomatically and economically, we need the resources, and we can't have those resources if we're tied up in a war in Ukraine and Israel blowing the crap out of everybody. So I think Trump is sincere about trying to bring peace to both regions. In the Middle East, it's complicated because of the whole Israel thing and the fact that Trump has built this cabinet, which is about 100% Zionist. I've never seen such a collection of pro-Zionists. But here's the thing. What Trump's doing with Israel isn't what it appears. I mean, he has boxed Israel out of major decision-making, things. He's boxed them out of, determining the future of Gaza. There's a lot of talk that he is actively conspiring to get Netanyahu removed from power.
Israeli media has been talking about Ynet, and other sources have been very concerned that Trump is actually moving toward a kind of Zelensky-like treatment of Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And articles about the honeymoon is over. Indeed, there is. We can talk about the complexities after what you say here, Scott. But there's because of course there's a lot of bad going on, but there's also a lot of nuance for, I think, real reasons that don't. Again, this isn't about Trump being good or bad, or it's about some reality. But continue, Scott.
No, I look. I wanted to avoid talking about the Middle East because it's a minefield. And trying to get inside Trump's head is a mission impossible. But I just gave you the best positive spin I can give on the situation. But I acknowledge it's positive spin because I don't know what the goals and objectives are. I just know this, that a war in the Middle East region between Israel and Iran that brings in the United States is the end of the Trump presidency, and Trump has to know that. Therefore, I have a hard time believing that Trump is going to be aggressively pushing policies that leads to the inevitability of conflict with Iran. That I have to believe that there's another purpose behind what he's doing. And again, I have to look for the evidence where it is. And when Trump and Putin have a long talk about what Russia can bring to the table in terms of negotiating with Iran about its nuclear deal, when Russia signs a security arrangement with Iran that is predicated on Russia providing nuclear reactors and nuclear fuel, to me, it's an indication that Russia may be sought out as an interlocutor for peace with Iran. But a lot of speculation there. It's I don't have the confidence in that analysis that I have with my assessments about Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, when as you're talking, I think there are points there that I certainly understand and believe to be true. Well, one of the things I especially believe to be true is that you said that a war between Israel and Iran would be the end of the Trump administration. It would be the end of a lot of things, and the Trump administration would certainly be one of the many things that would collapse.
It would be the end of Israel, just so people
it would be the end of Israel, and the U.S. is whatever strategic designs they have there for empire. That's going to be.
It may be the end of Iran too. I mean, I know there's a lot of Iranians out there puffing their chest out. I just want to let them know that yes, Israel's a small country, and yes, you have lots of capabilities, and yes, you could probably do fatal harm to Israel. You can't do fatal harm to the United States. You can hurt our economy. You can disrupt the political fortunes, but I will give you a guaranteed outcome of a conflict between Israel and the United States and Iran, and that's the end of Iran, the termination of Iran, violent termination. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this, but that's the inevitable outcome. You will not survive in the United States.
And there's also the nuclear question here is nuclear war could very much happen, and that's the
and we win. We win hands down. I mean, Iran doesn't win a nuclear war. We win a nuclear war every single time against Iran. But we don't want that. Nobody wants it. We're heading into the stupidity right now. Both sides.
It would be,
especially the Iranians.
It would be humanity's catastrophe. It would be humanity's catastrophe.
So that's why, I look at this and I'm like, this is out of control. I'm hoping that Trump has a different agenda, because this other agenda, this conflict agenda, it just takes us in a direction that it makes no sense. None whatsoever.
And then there's the question of Gaza. I mean, we mentioned Mahmoud Khalil, of course, the U.S. the U.S. resident who has been detained. Trump's of course, this is like Israeli lobby talk about activism opposing Israel's genocidal regime. And then there's what's going on in Gaza, these fragile, and of course Lebanon too, these fragile ceasefires, which, I mean, all of this is very
in Syria.
I forgot. Oh my, how did I forget Syria? An absolute powder keg itself. People forget that the reason why there's so much, one, it's because HTS, backed by, of course, the foreign entities of Turkey and Israel and all this, what they've done over the years, the U.S. too over the years, but why there's these mass pogroms and massacres is because people started to oppose what was going on there. People in Latakia, in Tartus, they were going to the streets. They're saying, this is not the kind of regime that we asked for. And that's why they're going around trying to final solution anyone who's not abiding by the extremist HTS. So this is all, I mean, Israel is trying to do greater Israel in Syria, and it's trying to salvage what was a massive defeat, which is another thing that could explode at any time. The massive defeat in Gaza, militarily at least, that powder keg could open up again, because Israel is very much dependent upon war, especially Netanyahu. So what I agree with is that Donald Trump's, and honestly, the U.S. as a power, a global power, an empire, cannot see a regional war explode again. But the risk is that, of course, Trump, with the backing that he does have from the pro-Israel, what we call lobby, the interest, those who are funding him, as well as those people around him, the tripwires are all there, and the options that are very much possibly against their interests, all there to be explored as we move forward. Final thoughts, Scott?
I'm just going to say the Middle East is a minefield. And, anybody who saw that, what was that movie about the EOD tech in Iraq? Great movie. Jeremy, he was a bomb tech, so I'm just saying that, if you saw that movie and you saw how dangerous it is to defuse bombs, that's what America's facing in the Middle East right now. Even if we want to do the right thing, there's no guarantee that one of these stupid issues are going to blow up and take us all down with it. It's a very, very dangerous situation. I think everybody should understand that even if Trump is trying to do the right thing in the Middle East, that may not be the outcome he gets, because it is a and Israel's the problem. I think we need to acknowledge this right up front. The greatest threat to security in the Middle East is Israel. And I think Trump knows it, which is why I think these reports you see in Israeli press about Trump trying to get rid of Netanyahu are true. Trump recognizes that he won't say that Israel's the greatest threat, but I think he will acknowledge that Benjamin Netanyahu is the greatest threat. And there's evidence to support that is, again, Donald Trump posting Jeffrey Sachs saying just that. So when the president of the United States puts on his social media Jeffrey Sachs saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is the greatest threat who has got America involved in wars, and Trump says, I don't want to do this anymore, maybe we should believe Donald Trump on this one. So I do think Trump's trying to prevent a war. I don't know if his methodologies will work. And I don't know that even if his intent is right, if he'll be able to succeed. This is a very, very dangerous situation. Very dangerous. Colonel McGregor has been saying for some time now, we are on the verge of a major war in the Middle East, a major, we didn't even bring up Egypt and, the potential of the Egyptian army getting involved right now. So, yeah, we'll leave it at that, because we could spend 14 hours going through the Middle East and we would never get to the bottom of all of these very complicated issues.
Yeah. And I look at Trump right now, especially on this question, as a walking contradiction, because truthfully, we all are living in contradictions. We all are facing contradictions. And for Trump, there's the side of him that is very pro-Israel, that is very, he has this history, he has these relationships. He very much believes in the Israeli project to many degrees. And then there's the other side of Donald Trump that's about Donald Trump. That's about the legitimacy of him, his existence as, narcissistic. He wants what he wants. And if he dives into a war too quickly, or dives into a war at all, like what we've been talking about, then yes, he is in fact done. And those two things together are going to bring, I think, just as we've seen, a lot of unpredictability. But what I think is predictable, what we already are seeing, is that there are these, you call them landmines, but there's just, whether it's Gaza and the ceasefire hanging by a thread, whether it's Lebanon, the ceasefire hanging by a thread, whether it's what's happening in Syria, is going to create shockwaves that we don't even know. We know how bad it is now, based on all those. I gotta say, screw all those people who cheered on Assad's downfall, because I knew from the very. I've known this for over a decade, that once that happens, the Syria is destroyed, and it's going to have ripple effects. We saw it with Libya already. So horrible ripple effects, and we're seeing it now. And then, of course, the Iran situation, Ansarallah, the whole axis of resistance. They're not pipsqueaks. They are going to continue to resist. what Israel is doing, and it could explode at any moment. And Trump, if he just, he's already inherited Ukraine. He's already, he's already having to deal with that. If he dives into this, then yeah, it's over for him. But also economically, it's a disaster, etc. But I want to get into these 60 seconds or less questions so we could head out of here, Scott, because it is getting late. So we kind of answered this already. So I hope QB saw the beginning of the show. What's the message of President Putin appearing in military uniform? So I'll just pull them up so you can answer.
For the Russian people. It's for domestic consumption.
So I'm just thanking people who've gave anything. I'm good with Congress paying out their own pocket to fix Nord Stream pipeline. If not, who will and how soon? I don't know if that was a serious question.
That's an interesting one. We can do that. It appears that the Trump administration is actually looking positively at a bid by an American businessman to because the Nord Stream conglomerate or whatever went bankrupt, and so it's up for auction, and Trump appears to be backing a bid by an American businessman to buy 50% of Nord Stream for the idea of bringing it back up online and getting Russian gas flowing in. But at least this way, Trump will say that it's 50% American controlled. So there's some movement in that direction. It's interesting.
This is the last question from Jeff. Scott, what will the battlefield cleanup look like in Ukraine?
Well, bodies decompose. That Mother Nature tends to take care of that. Hopefully there will be, body recovery teams. Unfortunately, nations been fighting wars for a long time, and we have great experience in going in, and we have the maps, we have the operational maps where the units are. We get the order of battle. We know who's missing, approximately where they were when they're missing, and then you try and find the bodies. You try and get that. They're still finding bodies from World War I in the fields of Europe. They're not going to get all the bodies. They're going to be around a long time. Unexploded ordnance, again, World War I, a lot of artillery on a static line. You still have artillery shells being dug up. I think that's going to be a situation in Ukraine as well. The unexploded ordnance factor is going to be real. Unfortunately, there'll be farmers who will lose their lives. There will be farm animals that will lose their lives, children that will lose their lives because of the horrors of war. But, we do have technology, and if we can bring this war to an end, I do believe that, the world has the ability to come in and assist in the cleanup of the conflict zone.
All right, everybody. That's Scott. We had a dynamic conversation that lasted probably a little too long for both of us, but we appreciate all of you coming out. It was a big show tonight. Be sure to hit the like button before you leave. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Be sure to go to the video description. You can find Scott's Telegram. Be sure to look at the Russia House. He's doing a lot of great interviews.
Got a new interview coming out tomorrow, and I just posted a new article on the Russia House today, dealing with Bandera and the ideology of Bandera and how it impacts Ukraine, and that's sort of an important topic when we talk about bringing it in for this conflict. So yeah, the Russia House is recommend people give it a look.
Yeah, subscribe. Subscription only, because
it's the only way we can do this.
Yeah, you got to keep it going. So be sure to look at that. You can go to the video description of this video too, this stream too, to look at Patreon, Substack for supporting this channel. That helps keep the lights on, especially in Q1 here on YouTube, Q1, as well as just economic hard times right now for a lot of people that's hitting. So I understand if you can't. So if you can't support, be sure to hit that like button. Be sure to follow us on our social media. You can find all of that below. Subscribe here if you have not. I'm also streaming tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to put that in the video description and in the chat. So be sure to go there. Wait. It'll be with Mark Sloboda. He's going to analyze all things Ukraine, battlefield, all things that have happened, geopolitical soapbox. Be sure to tune in. I put that link in the video description. All right, everybody, 2 p.m. tomorrow. I'll see you then. Scott, thanks so much again. We're going to head out together. Until next time, bye-bye.
Okay. Have a good night.